Ahoy! Since we have a couple of new artifacts this season, I wanted to make a tier list for all of the current existing artifact weapons and talk about how I think they rank at the moment, just roughly. Of course, there's subjective aspects to this. Of course, there are situations where certain artifacts could be better than I would place them here or worse, but just to give you a general idea. We're going to start with Odo. We're going to go through the order that New World Database has them listed in. That's what you're seeing on the right side here as well. And that is unfortunately one that I think is very, very weak overall. I think Odo doesn't really have many redeeming qualities. Odo's punishment is just fairly lackluster. It is a bit better now because it applies to knockdown targets. So maybe there's some niche use case where you can use Odo in your offhand and then use a spear or something, you get some extra damage out of it. But generally speaking, I don't think it is good in that regard. For most situations, it's relatively short and conditional where you get the extra damage compared to some other weapons that basically give you the extra damage almost permanently. Odo's defense has a 3 seconds cooldown for the base heal, which is also not great at all, and the life stealing on it is just not a very good perk on a flail. Refreshing move I used to initially like a lot, but I find that most of the time you're not really basic attacking much with the flail. You're using your combos and then you're switching to whatever other weapon you're using, except if you're using it with life staff, so even that doesn't have much value to me. So generally speaking, I don't think this is a good artifact to use in almost any situation. The Butcher is a bit weird, because it's simultaneously a fairly bad artifact in PvP, I would say. I don't think the value of that bleed really comes through most of the time, unfortunately. But on the other hand, it is very good in PvE. I will just place it right in the middle here, I think, because it is technically one of the best PvE artifacts. But if you look at the Butcher, different from some other ones we'll talk about later, you're not looking at it purely as a PvE artifact. A lot of people want to use this in PvP, and for that purpose I found it to be not satisfying, not justifying anything higher than B really. Whereas if you're using this as a DPS focused tank in PvE, I think there's a lot more value. In general, as a DPS build in PvE, if you're purely looking at this just from a PvE perspective, as we would for some other weapons, I would say this would be A tier. But again, this is such a mixed one that we're going to put it right in the middle here. The perks on it are decent at least. Obviously, there could be some better perks because it's very focused on that bleed overall. But it's good at what it does, and the DPS is good. So overall, I think this is a solid one. For the finisher, the situation is a little bit different because it is primarily a PvE artifact, and I think that's what most people are looking at it as, and in PvE it is probably the best or one of the two best artifacts that you can get. In PvP, I think it's a bit weaker because you also have Keen Tondo locked on it. Deadly Flourish, obviously not a great perk in general, so it could be even better if Deadly Flourish wasn't on it, but the passive of it is so strong that overall that makes up for it. And even from the PvP angle, the passive is very, very good. The finisher, Harmony, along with Keenly Jagged builds, is still very, very strong as well. You're not usually primarily using it for its own damage, but for the passive, and for that it's still very good. So overall, just one of the best artifacts that you can have in the game, and I think, honestly, a must-have in terms of farming if you're using anything that utilizes the rapier. Spark of Mjolnir is, in my opinion, a C tier. It's like not average, it's below average, but it's also not quite as bad as, for example, Odo. I think the lightning damage conversion has some value, though sometimes it's not necessarily doing much for you. Likewise, I think the weaken that you can apply with it can be beneficial in situations where you don't have enough other weaken. So this can be utilized, for example, as utility in PvE if you want to use it for that. It's not necessarily strictly necessary most of the time. It's not necessarily the most important thing that you want to have. It depends on your comp and everything. But I do think it has use cases. I do think it can be effective, but I do think it's also very niche. It has been drastically changed since PTR. You used to be able to just spam Mighty Gather with it. The weaken used to be 50%. So it's still alright. It's still not bad, but it's not a high priority artifact in my opinion. Scorpion Sting is one of the strongest artifacts in the game, especially for PvP. In PvE, it has niche use cases where you can just pull mobs closer to the group if you want to, but in PvP, it's just such a strong tool to counter range specifically or to get healers out of their group. And yes, it has been nerfed significantly, so I would put it behind Finisher, for example. It's just not quite as frequently usable, but it's still a very, very strong effect, a very unique effect that I think is also very fun. It's just a good artifact in how it's designed, and I would not want to not have one on my team if I ever have the option, even if it's just an offhand for someone. I think it's so impactful to have that pull that it can really turn any fight around. It also has some limitations through Sundering Javelin, through Transient Strike being locked on it. That's not necessarily what you want, depending on your build and everything. But again, the passive here in itself is so strong that I think it's fine to overlook that. If you're enjoying the video so far, consider subscribing and clicking the bell to support the channel. And if you'd like to support me further, you can do so on my Patreon. Now, Boltcaster is one of the new ones and is definitely on the stronger end. I will say, overall, for me to fully place it here, needs more testing. I would place it maybe here at the moment. I think the passive is very strong, the electrified passive by itself. We don't really have people specifically geared against it fully yet, so we'll have to see how much impact that has. At the same time, we don't have people fully geared for it yet for the most part either. Sure, some players do have the full sets, but many players don't. Likewise, the Bolt passive is technically very, very good, but Boltcaster is still good without it in AoE situations. The Bolt passive is very strong in 1v1 situations primarily, but it's also not quite as strong as it may seem on paper, so really needs more testing. I'm going to put it into A for now, but I do think it has absolute potential to go up to S. It's definitely an above average artifact overall. It's a very good one that is very usable in PvP especially. You can technically also use it in PvE if you want to. Why not, really, especially in situations where you get benefit out of the lightning damage. So yeah, it's definitely at least above average and maybe significantly above average. We'll see more about that once it's settled a bit more. The same can unfortunately not be said for the mechanic. Conceptually, I think this is a fantastic artifact. This sounds super fun, it's super cool with a trap, sticky bomb build. The problem is that the build itself just doesn't work well enough. The close range musket builds are just too ineffective with how the musket currently functions, in my opinion, with how you shoot at close range. You're just getting punished too hard for using the musket at close range at all. And without that, it's just a secondary utility to running it with a rapier and doing the damage with the rapier, at which point I'd rather have a finisher, for example. So there is just really not a use case for this. I think this could be so much better if they keep working on the right musket tree, if they make the trapper tree as a whole more viable without mixing in the left tree. At the moment, you can kind of use things from the right tree, but then you still put in things from the left tree. At the same time, of course, this kind of musket with a double perks on it also misses a lot of damage perks that other muskets have, which doesn't necessarily make things easier. So, in my opinion, not a good artifact for now, but could be at some point if they change things about the skill trees. The Abyss is absolutely an above average artifact. It's most certainly a strong one. It's obviously a PvP artifact. It's not really used much in PvE. I will say that I think it's not quite as good as some S tier ones, because it doesn't necessarily give you that much over not using it. You get the damage conversion, which can be breaking up the meta, especially in PvP situations, in large-scale PvP and wars. You're going to see a few Abyss on most teams, but it doesn't automatically make a normal Great Axe bad in comparison, and there are still benefits to running a normal Great Axe. The obvious advantage in this case is that you're able to run this with a mage offhand, which, if you like that, is very, very beneficial, but often that's just not what you're aiming for with a melee build. Often you are still running the more traditional options, like, for example, just a Warhammer. So it is, in my opinion, very, very strong, but I don't think it does anything like Scorpion Sting does, where it just fundamentally changes the game. It does affect the gearing meta, but with things like Boltcaster now coming out, the gearing meta is going to be affected anyways, I would say. What is nice in this case is that it kind of cuts through elemental aversion, because it's not really ranged damage, which gives it a few more points of being able to avoid certain barriers in terms of damage. But yeah, I think it's very, very good, and it could easily be argued to put it into S. It's definitely up here, but I do think that it's not quite on the level in PvP that, for example, Finisher would be in PvE in comparison. Finisher is just a no argument, you're running this all the time, but with Abyss, there are arguments to not run it as well. Inferno started as a pretty trash option, but it's, in my opinion, pretty solid now after the Season 4 patch, with the passive being useful, with it having Keenly Empowered and Vicious Locked, meaning it has, different from many other artifacts, very strong perks by default. You can basically put BIS perks on this with ease, because you already have 2 of them for many builds, which is, I think, very, very good in itself. And then the passive can be very good. Hellfire's Fury can be very good if you're using a close range build, a flamethrower build, and that's specifically what it's designed for now. Unfortunately, the strength scaling still has issues, with the dots still not scaling properly. The normal damage scales properly, but the dots don't. So it's not perfect. It's not, the perfect all-rounder. And while I think it's usable with melee weapons, it's not ideal. You're probably better off running a normal fire staff and running an int gem in your melee weapon until they end up fixing the dots or not. And so I wouldn't put it too high, but I do think it's good in the use case where you're running it with int and you're running it for flamethrower, which I think quite a few people do with fire staff. So you have a very consistent damage increase while in close range instead of a gem, which is a bit more conditional, which I like, but on the other hand, you lose a little bit of damage at long range depending on how you go. So yeah, I do think this is solid, especially because it's also not super hard to get or anything. It's just a dungeon run, and you get very good perks on it in return. So yeah, I think it's nice in that regard, but it's also not the best. Vengeance is a funny idea, I guess, but I just can't see any use case where I could argue this reasonably being viable for anything. A damage life staff, that seems too off for me. Maybe someone made it work somehow. Maybe someone has a very creative idea to make this effective somehow in a paladin build or something. I don't know. If you've seen something, if you've done something with it where you think this is actually viable and actually strong in any situation, and not just a fun thing to do, then definitely let me know. But for now, I would say this is alright at best at what it does, at what the idea for it is. And the idea for it is so niche and generally relatively weak most of the time that I do not think any reasonable use case for it can be argued. So it goes into D tier. Deep Freeze is, in my opinion, extremely strong. I'm not entirely sure where I want to place it here, if it's going to be A or S, but definitely somewhere between those two. I think the passive, especially Frozen, Rooted, and Shield enemies take 15% additional damage, which also applies on both weapons, is very, very good, and Ice Gauntlets didn't really need extra damage, to be honest. It also comes with Vicious and Refreshing Move, both definitely at least solid perks. So yeah, I really, really like this one. I think it has a lot of effective use cases. I cannot quite say if it's quite as good as, say, Finisher in PvE. I think it most certainly has high value in any build that utilizes an Ice Gauntlet where you're not looking for another artifact. Yeah, I would put it into maybe high A for now, but all of these are kind of very close together anyways. This entire area is really less contested than it would seem. This is all very close, and Deep Freeze very much has a chance to move up here. I do think it's definitely above average and maybe significantly above average. The same can be said for Lifetaker. I would argue that Lifetaker is maybe a little bit weaker than some of the other options that I would put above it. I think Lifetaker is an extremely strong offhand for ranged weapons, in particular, where you get the Disintegrate effect, so I would most certainly put it into A. It's definitely somewhat above average at least. I think the perks on it, with the restriction that you cannot get a gem slot, are alright. I think life stealing is maybe not something that a lot of builds want. Keen only really benefits you if you're using the Void Gauntlet specifically. Ref move, definitely not bad either. It depends. It has some perks that I feel like would work almost better for a Void Blade build, but then the passive doesn't really lend itself to a Void Blade build. So I do think there are maybe situations where you would not want to take it, and if you take it as an offhand for another ranged weapon, there's obviously a bit of increased danger coming along with that. But it's also very good in PvE, I think, as an offhand for healers, because your life staff artifact is not going to be Vengeance, so you can get some extra damage from that. Overall, I think very much a very useful artifact in many situations, and definitely at least an A tier. I probably wouldn't quite put it into S tier, but it could also be argued that it's up there. Either of the two anyways. Freya's Francisca is, in my opinion, the nichest of niche weapons. I think that the Throne Mastery, in combination with the Empowering Rending Throw, can technically be good. Refreshing Move on that is also alright. It's just so hard to effectively make a proper throwing hatchet build work. One of my mates has been running a build with Freya's Francisca successfully. It is possible, but it's very, very difficult, very, very niche. And there are a lot of other ways to achieve similar range damage that may just end up being a lot easier and more effective. I don't think it's quite as bad as what is in D tier, but I don't think it's close to B tier either, so I think it's very much a C tier item. Gladiator is so far down D tier that I almost forgot about its existence. I would argue that even Odo in comparison is significantly better compared to Gladiator. I don't know where this should be useful, because the passive itself with the bleed in return doesn't stack. It's just a refreshing bleed, which is really not that much damage by itself. The double shield passives, like the shield effects for abilities, are not useful in most situations for most builds. If you're using this with Flail, it's automatically terrible. Keenly Empowered is alright, and you get another damage perk, so that's cool, but really, you're cutting out shield aggression to even get jagged spikes, so you're losing damage just by putting on this round shield compared to a normal round shield, and that's just impossible to justify. They should do it like they do with some other artifacts and at least give you shield aggression on the jagged spikes passive as well. I think on the kite shield, for example, I do that, so that it stays more even, but as it stands right now, I just cannot find any reason to use it or any effective use case, unfortunately. Michael, I don't hate entirely anymore. I originally thought that was a pretty bad artifact, but with the knowledge that, for example, counterattack transfers over to your other weapon, that you can block with your other weapon and still get counterattack, that gives it a little bit more value. You can also put Enchanted Ward on it now, which also procs on your other weapon still, so that's something we verified. You can actually get the damage reduction from Enchanted Ward on your other weapon if you're putting it on a shield, which just overall gives it some room to be useful if you want to have counterattack Enchanted Ward and then you want to switch over occasionally to get the debuff cleanse. I think that's not horrible. I don't know if I want to put it into B tier or into C tier. I think it's still a niche thing to use, because really it's just kite shield users that use it in the first place, which is not that many. It's mainly flail players. So I do think it's definitely very specific, and you have to specifically play around it. But if you do that, then yeah, I think it's at least alright. I don't know if I care about lifestealing. I think there could be other triple perkers like counterattack, Enchanted Ward, and refreshing, for example, or refreshing move, depending on what you're after. That would be better. But then the debuff cleanse is also not bad, right? So there is reason to consider this more so than I thought at the start of the season, or at the start of the last season. And I will put it into C+, I would say. But I think it has room to go to B as well. Again, it's just very situational, very specific where you can effectively use it. The wall is pretty much mandatory for certain tanks in PvP, like in large-scale PvP especially. It has downside, obviously. You can't dodge while using it, and obviously Keenly Fortified is not ideal to have either, or at least in my opinion, because it cuts out certain other fortification perks that you could use otherwise. It's a bit limited in what perks you can put on it, so I wouldn't say it's the best all-rounder, but I would say it's at least good at what it does. In the specific situations where you need it, you're going to use it, absolutely. If you're a point tank that's just holding block, then you are going to use the wall. Outside of that, the use cases are somewhat more limited. I would say I put it maybe at the front of B. It's at least average, but also only used by a few players, really, for a very specific purpose most of the time. And it has some trade-offs compared to using a normal shield, aside of not being able to dodge, also just a perk combination that's locked on it. So definitely good, just not the best artifact out there. Pestilence originally was, in my opinion, one of the best artifacts in the game, and I would have put this into S tier, no doubt. The anti-heal plus plague and everything, it's just very, very good. And yeah, I like the Blight Enchantment effect a lot. I think the only thing that devalues it a slight amount, even though it also benefits from it, is that Plague Strikes, Plague Crits in general got buffed. So there is a bit more anti-heal going around just in general, which also means that Pestilence is not quite as necessary. Previously, I would have said you need Pestilence to counter healers effectively. Now I would say you can get away with two other weapons, one with Plague Strikes and one with Plague Crits, and you can counter healer with that, and you don't need Pestilence for that. But the effects on it are still very strong, the passive is still very strong. It's definitely still a good one. Maybe we just put it like somewhere into A tier. It doesn't really, like the placement here is not really locked. It could be at the front as well. It's just a very good one to have still. It's still a very good one to use, just not strictly mandatory in as many situations as before. Serenity is an easy one, that goes into S. In PvE, this is just as good as Finisher pretty much. Depending on what situation you're in, you might want to have Serenity more, you want to have Finisher more, AoE versus single target, blah blah blah, you get the idea. The effects on it with Transient Strikes and Transient Crits are very good, you can put a gem on it. Ref move not bad either, not complaining about that. And Balance Blade just gives you that nice extra damage on top of all that. It's just very, very strong. In PvP, I know people like it too. In my opinion, it's not the best option because I think there are better effects that you can have for PvP specifically in situations where you cannot get as many heavy attacks off. Though, then again, for defensive stance, it could be interesting too. But I would say that in PvP, I wouldn't quite place it as highly. I would say it's still good, but it's not the best in every situation. But in PvE, it pretty much is. So overall, a very, very strong artifact as well. That's the whole list. It actually looks pretty balanced at the end here. Maybe you could like shuffle some things around a bit. You could, for example, argue that the wall could go up or Michael could go up. Again, this is just my general feel. Nothing is completely set in stone. Things may change, especially for the newer artifacts here. I could absolutely see them go up. I just don't want to overrate them too early if it ends up not being the case. Whereas I'm pretty confident with the choices in D just not really being useful. And I really hope that they see some changes in the future and some buffs. And yeah, I hope this was interesting. If you have any thoughts on this, let me know in the comments. And if you'd like to see more like this, let me know as well. Consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you want to get notified of upcoming videos like this about New World in general and about other games. We're going to talk about Skull and Bones soon too, if you want to hear about that. If you'd like to support me further, then you can do so on Patreon and get early trading tips in return. Thanks to my patrons who already do exactly that, and thank you for watching. SLOTH, out.